So the myth of migration is the most powerful, insidious, and dangerous myths of our time today. And this is because it's very normalized. People don't question the messages that we are given about migration. And the problem is when myths become normalized, their power becomes tenfold. And what I want to do here today is I want to use my experiences to debunk this myth. And in doing so, this isn't going to be a political talk. It will delve into politics because one of the problems is that migration has been politicized. But this isn't about politics. I'm here to debunk this myth because it's ruining lives. And in doing so, debunking the myth of migration is an act of justice. So just to begin, I'm going to talk about the facts. So what are the facts? Migration is a very normal part of our humanity. It's been happening for centuries. Borders are actually a very new concept in the sense that when Britain, for example, colonized the world, borders did not exist, they didn't apply. When slaves were taken from West Africa to the West, borders did not apply then. So how the world is ordered today in terms of how we relate to borders is very new. Borders are man-made, so if you're hearing in the Brexit talks the issue of the Irish border, it's because of how they're going to maintain that border because it's very much man-made, it's a social construct. And borders do not apply equally. So if you have a red passport, for example, if you're a British passport, you can go to 185 countries visa-free. If you have a Nigerian passport, like I do, you can go to 46 countries visa-free. And if you have an Afghanistan passport, for example, you can only go to 5 countries. So borders do not apply equally. They very much favor the elite, the rich, and people who live in the West. And that brings me to what is the myth of migration. So I've split it off into two elements. So first of all, the politicization of migrants and migration, and then the criminalization of migrants. So how I would describe the myth of migration, it's bringing the movement of people into the realm of security. So governments have decided that migrants are a threat and they come under the realm of security, whereas poverty is not seen as a threat, even though poverty kills, and it's killing many people in the UK right now. Climate change, it's not seen as a threat either, even though there's been so many protests going on because it's urgent and climate change is going to kill us. It's already killing people in the global south. So the myth of migration is kind of this manipulation of what comes under security and bringing migrants under that realm. It's weaponizing hate, fear, racism and xenophobia into a system, legitimizing that, and using it to marginalize and abuse the most vulnerable people in our society. So Didier Bigot is an academic, and he explains it much better than I can. He talks about the different actors who instill, this fear in everyone, and he talks about experts from the military, for example, insist on the existence of rogue states, failed states, and the link between diasporas and their countries of origin. Intelligence services suspect that terrorism from abroad is supported by immigrants. Police explain the rise in crime by the activities of immigrants and their children who were not well socialized in the host country. And journalists evoke the feeling of insecurity among people. Economics kind of play up the burden on the welfare state of migrants. And together, all these actors legitimize this fear that migration is something bad, it's something we should all be worried about, and it's something that requires violence and force to mitigate and to control. So what are the components or kind of the environment that has allowed this myth to be perpetuated? And I think it's globalization and rising inequality. So right now, people are feeling very insecure. People are feeling very economically insecure specifically, and they want an explanation. Globalization, I've put a broad definition on there, but the definition that's relevant to migrants is economic globalization, which is free trade and giving corporations the power to do anything really to maximize profits. Borders don't apply to businesses, they don't apply to corporations. Dyson can take, their factories, move it to India or Bangladesh and exploit cheap labor there. There's no border issue there. Goods come and go, borders don't apply according to trade agreements and all, but goods are not kind of enforced the same way that people are. And it's all to benefit corporations. And this means that whilst globalization is making people rich, it's only making very few people rich. And an example of this is that Walmart in 2017, they made more profit in that year than the whole GDP of Belgium. Rising, and this also plays into rising inequality. So 1% of people in England own 50% of its land. The world's 2,200 billionaires got 12% wealthier, while the bottom 3.5 billion people grew 11% poorer. So globalization is not benefiting many people. It's the reason why a lot of people move as well. Because if you outsource your cost to take advantage and exploit cheap labor, what happens when those people you're exploiting want fair wages? They want to be able to feed their families. They're going to come here because they want to be free. They want to be able to provide. They want to be able to succeed. And then the other kind of environment that's allowed this myth to foster is criminalization as a form of governance. So governments know that people are insecure. They know that inequalities are rising. And instead of dealing with the deep systematic issues that have made this the way it is, so things like globalization, redistribution of resources, the fact that corporations have unfettered power, they don't do any of that. They won't even address climate change. They won't even address systematic changes that are needed to make the world work better for most of us. Instead, they mobilize hate, they stoke fear to make themselves look strong and powerful. So this has been going on forever. As I was doing my research, I found out in the 60s, Peter Griffin won a place in Parliament off the slogan, "If you want a N-word for a neighbor, vote Labour." This tactic it's secure. It's been working for years. They've always been doing this. Trump is the most recent example, but he's not the only one. Politicians are doing this around the West because it's easy. People are scared. They're worried about their future. So what do? You just blame someone who can't defend themselves, and everyone puts their trust in you. So the process of being tough on migration is now seen as synonymous with good governance. What are the effects of the myth? So the first time we had to really talk about this myth properly in the UK, or people didn't perceive it as a myth, but when the Windrush scandal happened, we had to have the conversation on the immigration system. It wasn't had properly, which is why I'm here to carry on that conversation, but we still talked about it. We saw that the system is unfair. The system punishes innocent people. So Windrush generation have been here since the 60s. They've worked. They've contributed to the economy. They're what I call the model. They're the perfect good migrant, right? And this is still what happened to them because the good migrant, bad migrant dichotomy doesn't exist. The system punishes us all. And 11 people died as a result of Windrush before their cases could be resolved. And that's of the people we know because so many people didn't come forward. There's no trust in the system. And Windrush brings me to talk about the hostile environment, because that's essentially what it was. And because it affected, quote unquote, the wrong people, doesn't mean the hostile environment isn't messed up. It's predicated on making living in the UK so unbearable for migrants that they voluntarily leave. And it's really hard because my question is, why are you so sure that people are going to voluntarily leave? Why do you not understand that it takes desperation for people to come here? No one's going anywhere. This is the best they can get, and there's a reason why people move, and it's not because they just feel like it. It's not because they just want to come here. It's because they're desperate. It's because they don't have a choice. And what the hostile environment entailed was basically taking away legal aid, increasing fees, detaining people, deporting people, requiring the burden of proof to be on migrants to legitimize and prove that they have a right to be in this country. And what happens when the Home Office, they decide, so if they don't like the documents you've presented, then you don't deserve to be here. And that's essentially what happened in the Windrush scandal. But the hostile environment affects, so many more people. It's basically a system that creates conditions that make it impossible for people to have lawful status and then punishes them for that reason. So I became undocumented when I was 19, despite living in the UK since I was 9. And I've realized that it doesn't matter how long you've been here, it doesn't matter how hard you work, no one is safe. So I didn't have access to good lawyers because there's no legal aid. So what that happens is that pushes people to use whoever they can to do their applications. And sometimes that process can go wrong. And that happens to so many more people. The immigration system in terms of like the lawyers, it's not so strongly regularized. So people keep getting caught off and going to bad lawyers in order to save money. And basically my application got rejected and I was undocumented for 2 years. Because first of all, didn't have access to legal aid, so I couldn't do my application and didn't have any money. And it had to be a process of waiting till there was enough money to do it. And it's really hard to punish people for being illegal and undocumented, but then also creating the conditions that pushes them to that position. A really good example of this is Chagos. It's an island, and the UK colonized it. They forcibly removed people from it, and then used that as a US airbase. They gave them really small compensation, pushing them into poverty, and these people decided to migrate to the UK because if you're colonized, you can migrate to the colonizer's country. I think back then the law allowed for that. Came to the UK because of the poverty that was induced on them, only to be caught up in a hostile environment as well. And this is my friend Ken. So I was away at campaign boot camp and I met him there and we were both campaigning against the hostile environment. He came to the UK in 2009. He had lawful status, but then they increased the fees that you have to meet. So you have to earn a certain amount to be able to renew. They increased that amount and he didn't meet it, so he became undocumented. He then was later detained, and it took his friends raising noise about it, going to the press for him to be released. Till now, he still hasn't got a decision for his application. And the problem is that the Home Office only focus on individual acts and then they act. But when you only look at individual cases, you don't see that the whole system is flawed. And the problem in the UK is that we don't realize that our immigration system is really flawed. We always look to the US and we're like, Trump's wall and all these things, but really it looks more like this. And an example of this is what's happening in Libya right now. So the UK is complicit and the EU is funding the Libyan Coast Guard to curtail migrants from getting to Europe to claim asylum. Claiming asylum is a human right. The Refugee Convention, which was enacted after the Holocaust, when people were trying to flee and they ended up being killed because people would not let them claim asylum. That's a human right. And the EU is part of funding the detainment of African migrants where they're abused, raped, tortured. They're not allowed food, water, and it came to the media's attention when they were being sold as slaves. So history is literally repeating itself because of this myth. Now I'm going to talk a bit about myself, a bit more. So I joined Let Us Learn, a campaign group, when I was 18 and found out that I couldn't access student finance because of the hostile environment. Which is why I say there's no good migrant, bad migrant. The system it doesn't want migrants and it doesn't discriminate. Join Let Us Learn to advocate for access to education. And I've ended up taking my story everywhere because I've realized that the only way this myth is going to be debunked is if people who've experienced it talk about it. So I'm now on a 10-year route to citizenship, which means that every 30 months, I have status now, but every 30 months I have to renew, and I have to pay £2,033 each time. And if I can't afford to, then I'm undocumented. And then you can get detained, deported, all of it. So, there's been no freedom. It's consistent, and this is going to stay with me for the rest of my life. So I've realized that all I can do is to just talk about it and to just try and debunk this myth so that people can stop suffering because of it. And resistance. People have been resisting the myth. This is a group of doctors who got medals for their services during the Ebola outbreak, and they returned it to number 10 because they were disgusted at the fact that the NHS has been conscripted to now act as border enforcement. So they were sharing data with the Home Office. They were told to refuse patients who need care if they don't have the right documents. And this kind of conflicts with doctor-patient confidentiality and the right to treat people who need help. So some doctors are resisting. Stansted 15, I don't know if you guys heard about it, but it was a big case. They did a peaceful protest on a tarmac to stop a deportation flight and ended up being charged with terrorism. It was so bad that Amnesty got involved, and they said that charging them with terrorism inflicts on the right to protest, which is, democracy, that's a human right. So we're seeing our government use this myth to perpetuate a system of abuse that allows them to take advantage of the vulnerable and to do whatever they can to keep that system in place, even if that means charging peaceful protesters with terrorism. And then, so their excuse is that it is willfully misleading to conflate the situation experienced by people from the Windrush generation with measures enforced to tackle illegal immigration and protect the UK taxpayer. But my problem is, who is the UK taxpayer? Because my mum has been paying taxes for the 16 years since she came here, yet she still has to live under the system that punishes you just for existing. I'm a taxpayer. When I've worked, I've paid taxes. Migrants are taxpayers. So this dichotomy of them and us, or the other, is very much fabricated. And then using taxpayers' money to maintain a system of abuse. So there was the right to rent appeal, which just happened. So in 2010 to 2015, there was a new law that meant that landlords had to then check status before allowing people to rent. This meant that many migrants and people who could not prove that, even when the burden of proof is so high, if you couldn't meet it, you were destitute, you were homeless. And the courts found this against human rights. I think it was just this month. 78,000 was spent on challenging, a discriminatory law. Other parts of the hostile environment have been challenged in court. So the NHS sharing, school sharing, that's been successfully challenged in court. So how much money are they spending to maintain the system of abuse? Detaining people, 164.4 million is spent on indefinite detention per year. And the UK is the only country in Europe that detains people indefinitely. And finally, 65% of people who get detained get sent back into the community. So you're traumatizing really vulnerable people. People in detention are, they've been trafficked, they've been abused, they're LGBTQ people looking for sanctuary because their home countries are homophobic. They're the most vulnerable people in our society, fleeing war, fleeing conflict, and you detain them, traumatize them, just to release them back into the community and spend 1.6.4 million per year. It just makes no sense. And Gary Younge summarized this perfectly when he stated that this isn't a system of law, it's not a lawful system, rather it is the system, this is not a glitch in the system, sorry, it is the system. They have violated no law, it is the law that is violating them. But there is hope. I don't know if you guys heard about the Youth Strike for Climate, but when I was younger, I was never protesting or demonstrating. So it makes me filled with so much pride that young people are fighting for the future we deserve. And I just want to say that the more we debunk this myth and realize that it's not true, the more we can focus on the systematic issues that are actually ruining our lives, things like climate change, things like poverty, inequality, austerity. People are really suffering, and it's not because of migrants. So the more we debunk this myth, the more we can actually solve the real problems that are plaguing our society today. And finally, I just want to say the best way we can fight against this myth is to just choose love. That's all you can do. We're using hate to build our future. Hate crime has literally over doubled in the last 5 years. Our future is now being built by the worst parts of our humanity, the hate, the fear, the racism, the xenophobia. So choose love. We need to switch that up. We need to build our future based on the best parts of ourselves. We need to build our future based on freedom, based on love, based on basic human rights. Why are we letting people die at sea? It doesn't make any sense. So choose love. Thank you.